very hearty welcome to all my esteemed listeners. Today we shall discuss a very interesting political concept which is called nationalism. Now, why I call this concept interesting is because the understanding of nationalism will help us to analyze whether the actions of a particular nation state are positively or negatively loaded. The word nationalism, in fact, comes from a Latin term, natio, N-A-T-I-O, natio, which meant birth or which means birth. Nation, therefore, was the place of birth of a particular individual, and nationalism has to do with the feelings of affection, the feeling of love, the bond that one individual feels towards his or her nation. Now, nationalism as a concept is more of a sentiment. It is more of a psychological element. It is something, in fact, which is not material, neither is it mechanical. It has got to do with the kind of feelings that an individual shares or holds for his or her motherland. Nationalism arises when a substantially large body of people who live in a common geographical area, who have shared a particular period of common history together, and who are culturally similar, as in having a commonality of language, religion, maybe caste, maybe race, and all the factors that we bring into culture. When such bonds of commonality bind people together and they feel a bond towards each other as well as to the piece of land, the territory which they inhabit, that positive feeling, that bond of unity is referred to as nationalism. In fact, nationalism has been defined by C.D. Burns as a sentimental political concept directly related to the struggle for power, which respects the individuality of the states, recognizes variations in laws and governments, and segregates group from group on the basis of common core of ideals and beliefs. Now, this definition more or less sums up the basic factors which constitutes the feeling of nationalism. It has already been mentioned over here that the concept of nationalism is directly linked to the struggle for power. As in, when a group of people feel bound to their nation states, to the places of their birth or to their motherlands, in such a way that they want to resist any kind of interference from a foreign power in terms of ruling. For example, a colony or a subject nation will obviously feel resentful towards the colonial masters or the imperial masters because the people inhabiting those colonies or subject nations will feel that their motherland is being disrespected, being violated, and therefore they will go to the ultimate lengths of sacrifice in order to free their motherland from subjection. Also, it mentions over here that nationalism as a concept respects the individuality of states. We know that the international space or the international stage is inhabited by almost close to 200 nation states at the last count. Now, each of these states have an individual characteristic, an individual personality, like perhaps each individual person does. It is nationalism which helps us to distinguish one state from the other. Another factor that is mentioned in this definition is that it further recognizes, nationalism further recognizes that with a change in nation states, legal systems as well as governments will automatically change, more or less in keeping with the cultural heritage, the political history, the geographical location of that particular country. This gives a unique identity to each of the nation states. Also, it helps groups of individuals to identify themselves on the basis of certain set of common cultural patterns or cultural traits, political beliefs, as well as on the basis of geographical contiguity. People manage to identify themselves. And in the process of identifying themselves, they also manage to segregate or separate themselves from another exactly such a group of people. Thus, we understand that in the mental construction, the physiological construction and the psychological construction of a nation, nationalism happens to be a very, very important factor. We shall also consider another definition of nationalism given by Louis L. Snyder, which happens to be very comprehensive, gathering together or putting together most of the important elements that constitute the phenomena of nationalism. He says, nationalism as a product of political, economic, social, and intellectual factors at a certain stage in history is a condition of the mind, a feeling, or a sentiment of a group of people living in a well-defined geographical area, speaking a common language, possessing a literature which expresses the aspirations of the nation, and attached to common traditions and common customs, venerating its own heroes, and in some cases having a common religion. In fact, these are the very factors which help a nation to grow in its spirit of nationalism, or helps people to imbibe the spirit of nationalism. We shall shortly take up these factors for a detailed discussion. Now, before moving into the factors which constitute nationalism or which aid the creation of the feeling of nationalism, we shall enter into a very brief discussion, a very cursorial discussion of the historical development of the phenomena of nationalism. Now, this can be divided into two phases. One phase which dates before the 1880s, and the second phase which definitely considers the period of time after the 1880s. Now, before the 1880s, I shall begin from the beginning, as in the time of the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. During these two periods of time, the feelings that people entertained or had towards their place of birth was confined strictly to the city-states in the Greek age and the civitas in the Roman age. Now, beyond these city-states, not many people moved. So they were not even aware that maybe as a group they had a distinct identity, a distinct set of cultural traits, a distinct polity, or a distinct social political setup. Now, as time progressed, with the coming in of the medieval times, we come to a time when a tug of war happens between who was more supreme, whether it was the church or it was the king. The size of the empires grew, but the movement of people still remained confined to perhaps the village where they were born, or the locality in which they were born, and largely people spent their lives without much traveling or trading or communication. Therefore, once again, the feelings or sentiments that people harbored towards their nation states, actually there was no conception of nation states as such. It will happen only after the end of the Middle Ages. Before the end of the Middle Ages, during the entire period of the Middle Ages, which is a considerable period of time, people mainly feel positively or negatively towards their kings. Not much is felt in terms of the geographical area in which people were situated or located. Now, the end of the Middle Ages was brought about by the Renaissance and the Reformation, and consequently, these two movements led to what is known as the Industrial Revolution. Now, right from the beginning of the Renaissance and Reformation movements, slowly the concept of nation states started building. people started identifying with the territory in which they were born, the place where they lived their lives, had their thoughts, conducted their activities. Slowly, the concept of individual nation states was building up. Now, as the Industrial Revolution paved the way for capitalism, and capitalism slowly prospered and progressed along with liberal democracy, a very, very strong nation state was born with the sole intention of providing police activities, security activities to the newly emergent bourgeois classes. Now, though the state was only more or less only performing functions for the rich or the propertied classes in a particular society, nonetheless, people became aware of the importance of their nation states. There were also certain feelings, certain psychological attachments which were being delivered or developed towards these nation states. Now, as you can understand, during this phase, that is the time period before the 1880s, nationalism remained largely a psychological phenomena, something which was born out of sentiments, feelings, emotions, something which had no material or monetary basis at all. But this was going to change after the 1880s, because with the further development, unharnessed, unhurdled development of capitalism, what happens is, inevitably, the more progressive or industrialized nation states enter into a rush for capturing colonies. Trade improves, communication and transport improves, and with the rapid improvement in transport and communication, the movement of masses of people from one place to another, the entire scenario changes, and changes very, very rapidly. Now you had entire masses of people moving from one country to another and coming into contact with people who had lifestyles which was completely different from their own. Languages differed, religions differed, customs, traditions, norms, everything differed. Suddenly, people became conscious of their own identities, and they also became conscious how others were different from themselves. Now, this further created a feeling of attachment, maybe deep love, deep respect, and pride, honor, glory to the place of birth of a particular individual. Now, if a person belonged to country X, he would start feeling that his country was the best. Whatever constituted his country, the culture, the political get-up, the economic system, the social economic structures, and everything that pertained to X was probably better than anything outside of X. Slowly, this race for capturing colonies would take the form of imperialism. That is, colonial masters would start becoming imperial masters also. They would thrive to establish their political control upon the markets that they had captured. Now, once they became imperial masters, automatically they would try to impose their own understanding of an administrative system, a uniform administrative system, in order to gain greater control upon these captured areas. Now, this imposition of a foreign culture, a foreign political system, a foreign social system would inevitably lead to clashes between the master and the subject nation. It was during this phase that nationalism would move from its psychological aspect to becoming more of an economic nationalism. And it would assume a form which was definitely more aggressive than its previous incarnation. Now, this is more or less a summary, a very short summary of the development of the phenomena of nationalism. With that, we move into the next segment of our discussion, which is the factors which contribute to the making of the entire phenomena of nationalism. The first and the most important, perhaps the most basic factor which contributed to the growth of nationalism was geographical contiguity. The word contiguity means continuousness. That is, the most basic premise for making a group of people feel like a nation would be that they belonged to a geographical territory which was lying contiguous to each other. That is, a geographical territory which was not separated by any physical body, like maybe a mountain range or maybe an extension of another political territory in between. I can clarify this by giving you a very common example, a very easy example. For instance, immediately after the independence or at the hour of independence of India, the Pakistan that was born at that point of time was divided into two parts. What is present-day Pakistan was known as West Pakistan at that point of time, and the country which is today known as Bangladesh was known as East Pakistan. Now, if you imagine the map of India, you will realize that a very large territory of northern India, northeastern India, lay in between these two parts of the country or the nation state called Pakistan, which was born at that point of time. And we are also aware of the sad history that followed the creation of Pakistan. East and Western Pakistan could not manage to stay together, and one of the very major reasons for their non-survival was perhaps the fact that a foreign country, because India by then had become foreign to them, a foreign country's territory lay in between their own territories. So the first and the most basic premise of making a group of people feel like a nation is that the geographical area or the territory should be contiguous. That is, it should be continuous. There should be no physical or otherwise any kind of obstruction within the geographical expanse of a particular country. Firstly. Secondly, within this very point of common territory, we shall discuss the natural boundaries. Now, by this, of course, I mean all the geographical, physical features that we have studied as students of geography, but not as in, taking an interest in them from the geographical point of view, but from the psychological point of view. Firstly, natural physical features help us to form a concrete idea about the physical location and physical construction of a particular nation. Secondly, it helps us to identify and separate one nation state from another nation state. As in, as an Indian citizen, I have a very clear notion of where my country begins, where it ends. And as the government of a particular country, the people making laws, policies, and providing security functions also have a very clear idea as to how much area exactly lies under their jurisdiction. Also, these very physical features help to constitute the psychological makeup or the psychological build of the people inhabiting these particular areas. Because as we know, climatic conditions are very big determining factors in how people are, as far as their activities or their orientations are concerned. Now, in areas which are mountainous, people are used to a very hard way of life, and they are prone to greater physical exertions for even meeting their simple physical needs. On the other hand, people living in very fertile areas which are also plains, undulating plains, people have a more easier attitude towards life. They don't have to work much harder in order to achieve their physical needs or meet their physical needs. Also, other climatic factors like the weather, whether it is a continuous monsoon or it is an extreme period of cold followed by an extreme period of heat, like in the deserts, all these factors help to orient people towards their country. Okay, now good, bad or ugly, obviously as citizens we accept our motherlands, and that is exactly the word that is used to denote the deep bond of love, of affection that we feel towards the country in which we are born. Nonetheless, it helps us to create our orientations, and it helps us to build our attitudes towards life, towards work, towards laws, towards the government, etc. Also, a separate territory is very, very important for a group of people so as to help them identify themselves as a nation separate from other nations. This is why a common territory with geographical contiguity and a distinguishing set of natural boundaries is extremely important factor contributing to the growth of nationalism. The second factor that contributes to the phenomena of nationalism is common historical background. Now, when ages of our predecessors, our forefathers, have lived together and they have had shared experiences of victories or defeats, of subjection or of ruling, of joys and of sorrows, it is but natural that people who are apparently divided by time, place, culture may manage to hark back or to remember a common past and overcome present-day problems by looking up to or by referring to a shared common history. Moreover, countries which have experienced colonialism or imperialism at some point of time in their history further treat the period of their struggle for independence as a very sacred, as a sacrosanct period of their history. Their constitutions make a conscious effort to instill in present generations the same ideas, the same ideologies which at one point of time had brought about or made possible the nationalist struggle. Thus, a common history goes a long way in fostering unity and in keeping a country united or integrated in the face of all troubles, internal or external, that a country might face today. A common past is always very, very revered and very, very respected and a very important factor in keeping people together in situations of crisis. The third important factor in the creation of the phenomena of nationalism is that of cultural similarity. Now, culture, as we know, will comprise of race, language, religion, and some customs, traditions, norms, and conventions which are commonly held by a group of people. Commonality of culture will help people to remain united. Usually, cultural traits are held to be sentimentally charged items which produce reactions within people which can be sometimes very aggressive. People are usually very protective about their language, their racial identity, about their religions. And this particular trait has been one of the main constituents of parochial identities. As in my culture, my language group, the language group that I belong to, the religious group that I belong to, the race to which I belong, has helped me to become what I am. My conceptions of good and bad, of sacred and profane, of ought to and ought not to, have been largely formed by my cultural identity. Therefore, people are usually very sensitive regarding their culture and their cultural identities. It has helped, culture has helped people to feel united and to tide over problems once again, both from other cultural groups that might exist within the geographical boundaries of a particular country or from external threats that have come from outside. Now, these are the three main factors which have contributed to the growth of nationalism. Nationalism has been fostered, or states have made particular attempts to foster nationalism or strengthen the spirit of nationalism by the use of certain common signs, symbols, like maybe the national flag, the national song, the national anthem, even things like national animal or national bird, etc. Specific days have been highlighted as national holidays. Some personalities have been credited with having made huge contributions to the creation or the building of a nation. And usually their birth anniversaries are celebrated as national holidays. Important dates in the history of a particular country have been fostered again and again in the minds, in the psyche of the general masses, so as to keep them going back to what really constitutes their nation. Because only when I'm aware of the identity of my nation can I become proud of it. And only when I'm proud of my nation will I be ready to make sacrifices for my nation. to leave my interest or to let go of my personal interest in order to ensure that my nation survives, my nation prospers. That is what exactly the idea behind the phenomena of nationalism is. Now, having discussed the factors which contribute to the growth of nationalism, we shall take a very brief look at its merits and demerits. Nationalism, as we have discussed so far, seems to be a largely positive concept, a positively oriented or motivated concept, which creates unity amongst people, which helps people to make sacrifices for the sake of society, for the sake of their nation. It might even help to build peaceful international relations. It fosters social, political, economic creativity, wherein people try to surpass other nations and to project their own nations as the best. Therefore, considering from this particular angle, nationalism would seem to be a very positive phenomenon. But on the flip side, nationalism, when treated as love for my country, definitely is positive. But if my love for my country becomes so possessive that I begin to see every other state as an enemy, or every other state as a challenge to my existence, or every other state as a satellite that I can use for my own prosperity, it gives rise to what is known as aggressive nationalism. And that has led to numerous wars and numerous bloody wars across human history. It has led to the conception of white man's burden. What the Europeans, the West Europeans to be more specific, have considered themselves to be the most civilized people, and they have considered it their bounden duty to civilize the rest of the world. And in an attempt to do so, they have justified the most gruesome, the most cruel tortures that they have inflicted upon their subject nations. Having considered the merits and demerits of nationalism, we may conclude that nationalism seems to be somewhat like water. It takes on the color which you add to it, whichever color be it. When taken positively, nationalism can actually egg on a state to become better than what it was, and to become better than the rest. It can be the most positive, most motivating factor to help people or to egg people on to surpass their own expectations and to do better for themselves as well as for their nations. On the other hand, if it falls in wrong hands, nationalism can lead to the same kind of fanaticism that economy or the search for power, the struggle for power, or the quest for power actually at one point of time did. Now, this fanaticism might actually end up leading to devastation of the entire human race, as we have witnessed in the past 2 world wars. Therefore, it is to be considered very, very carefully how we treat nationalism, which of its aspects we accept, and at which point of time we stop ourselves from feeling that yes, my nation is good, it is perhaps the best, but I have no problem with another nation existing with its own set of unique cultural, political, economic, social traits. An atmosphere of mutual respect and tolerance will lead to the creation of a healthy world where nationalism is not stretched to its extremes. Because we must remember, what is good in moderation is calamity in excess.